Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this installment of Constitutional Law. Tonight we're going to be talking about federalism. And federalism is something that you probably grasp some concepts of from your previous studies in American government. But in this class, we're really going to kind of dive deep into two aspects of it. And then next class, we're going to explore one of the most interesting powers that Commerce has, and that's the powers granted under the Commerce Clause. The preparation for this class was to read McCulloch versus Maryland and the United States versus Comstock. Next class, and we'll talk about this at the end too, you're going to read Gideon versus Ogden, Swift and Co. versus the United States, and Wickard versus Philborn. As usual, keep putting these in your notes, and that will be a big part of your grade. So, three major provisions that we're talking about. There are more. Congress has lots of enumerated powers, but tonight we're going to be focusing on necessary and proper and the supremacy clauses. Next class, we'll talk about commerce. The text, and quick note, this is going to be pretty quick because while it's very important that we cover it, it also makes a lot of sense, and we don't have to go into a crazy amount of detail here. The text is the first thing we want to look at, and the text for the necessary and proper clause is that Congress shall have the power, and along with all the other enumerated powers, it says to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers and all other powers vested by the Constitution to the government of the United States or in any department or office thereof. Short and sweet, it means quite a bit when we take it in context with the Supremacy Clause and then with the Commerce Clause next class. The Supremacy Clause, the Constitution and the laws of the United States, which shall be made in pursuance thereof, and all treaties made or which shall be made under the authority of the United States shall be the supreme law of the land, and the judges in every state shall be bound thereby, anything in the Constitution or laws of any state to the contrary notwithstanding. So essentially, under the Supremacy Clause, again, very straightforward. Everybody has to follow what the federal government says unless there are specific powers that are reserved to the states. So let's move on to McCulloch versus Maryland. In McCulloch versus Maryland, this deals with a national bank that was established. And this was the second national bank. Don't really remember what happened to the first one. Doesn't matter for the purposes of this discussion. But what happened was that Maryland decided we're going to tax that bank. It's existing within our territory. We should have the ability to make some money over it. But the person in charge of the bank said, no, we're not going to be paying those taxes, and refused to pay. It went all the way up to the United States Supreme Court after lawsuits had been filed. And ultimately, the question here, so the issue, was one, whether or not Congress could establish a national bank to begin with, and two, was it lawful for Maryland to tax it? These seem like simple questions now, but these were legitimate things that the Founding Fathers had to cope with at the time, and once they figured it out, serves as the basis for a lot of the things we rely on today. So what was reasoned was that Congress absolutely could establish a national bank. They said that necessary and proper means that the country can do, and that the legislature can do anything that is appropriate and legitimate related to any of their powers that they have. And because of that, yeah, they can create a national bank. But the second question, can Maryland tax them? That's where this Supremacy Clause comes into effect. And the answer is no. They cannot tax a United States bank. And the reason is kind of spectacular. I hope you guys saw this in the reading. The court recognizes that the power to tax is the power to destroy. And we cannot grant any state the power to destroy a federal institution, that would violate the Supremacy Clause. So McCulloch versus Maryland is a great example of how Congress uses their various powers, is in particular the Necessary and Proper Clause and the Supremacy Clause. Your next case is Comstock versus the United States versus Comstock. This case deals with the sex offender registry, and I'm sure that everybody has heard about that. It's definitely made news recently. I think that, it's definitely a very interesting thing. The problem with, in my opinion, the sex offender registry is absolutely everything can be a sex offense, and if everything's a sex offense, then does it have any meaning? With the sex offender registry, there is something referred to as civil commitment. And civil commitment seems like it might be something that's good. Effectively, the law gives the government the ability to lock people up against their will to get them treatment when they are a danger to society because they're a sex offender. In practice, it's a little bit more difficult than that. And the reason it's a little bit more difficult is realistically, what happens is it's a mechanism where people who are sex offenders could, in theory, be locked up forever. There's no real way to get out of civil commitment once you've been civilly committed. To put it differently, the commitment is until such time as the person is no longer a danger to society, or that they graduate the program. And in the state of Missouri, at least, nobody, to my knowledge, has ever graduated the program. So naturally, sex offenders who were committed under this new federal law were rather concerned about their ability to ever be out of custody. They sued, and yeah, the court holds that, yes, this is necessary and proper to protect society. The court, in the majority opinion, establishes a 5-part test. And the things that they're going to look at are the necessary... they state that the Necessary and Proper Clause grants broad discretion. The court recognizes that Congress has long delivered mental health treatment to prisoners. There's a good reason to pass this statute, as it has the power to protect the community from the dangers of some prisoners. The 10th Amendment doesn't particularly grant this authority to the state, and the court recognizes that the statute was narrow in its scope and did not give Congress a general police power, which definitely would have been something reserved to the state. This is a modern example of how that Necessary and Proper Clause still exists to give Congress power that wouldn't necessarily exist otherwise. Like I said, this class is short and sweet. I mostly just wanted to make sure that we covered those provisions. It makes a lot more sense once we get to the Commerce Clause. Don't worry, guys. We're also going to move beyond some of the more fundamental constitutional stuff. Once we get into the Bill of Rights, that's what people are really typically interested in. I'm not going to have you do a discussion this week over these concepts, because I'm going to try and I want you to focus on reading your cases for the Commerce Clause, and in particular, I want you to pay attention to how the cases evolve. Next class, we'll talk about some of the examples of when, in recent history, the court has kind of pulled back against the Commerce Clause, but in general, you're going to see the power granted to Congress under the Commerce Clause expand over time. The order in which I presented the cases is designed to also help you illustrate that. I mean, it is chronological, but it's also developmental. So take a little bit of time to read those cases. I'll get this next lesson up for you all next week, and I hope you all have a great weekend. Thank you very much, and see you soon.